weirdly, this actually started when I was on an airplane. I've flown a lot in my life, which I actually don't like. I don't like to fly. It makes me very nervous, but I was looking out on a city at night, and I was seeing that the streets and the cars and the sort of layouts of the city started to resemble vessels, blood vessels and flesh. It almost looked like an organism. There's this whole existence that we have that kind of operates like a body. And I started to think more about what that means, if anything. And I started to think more about individualism and collectivism and countries and groups and just sort of how we view ethics. And I started to form a very rough concept of how things may in fact work in our reality. And I guess you could root the description of it in biology. So we've got cells, and these cells die and they fight and they live and they do things. And we don't, as individuals, we don't care when our cells die. Right? If you touch somebody's arm, some of their cells have died, nobody cares. And these cells, they live to make our organs and other parts be able to survive. And those organs and other parts, they live so that we can survive. And there's a little bit of a hierarchy here forming, where each cell does have some inherent value as it is alive, and even just it does exist, which probably carries with it some inherent value as well. But certainly for us, we don't consider it any sort of moral issue to fight cancer, even though cancer cells are just as legitimate cells as our own body cells, but we don't have any problem killing them. And that's because we want to protect and enhance and allow to survive our organs, which in turn allows us as individuals to survive. And the same thing can be observed as you go up the chain. Smaller parts are important, but they're usually not as important as the bigger parts. And so when we get to the individual level, if I were to, for example, punch myself in the face, I might get a lot of funny comments and views. But I don't think a lot of people would consider that as ethically dubious as if I were to go and punch someone else in the face, even though from a sort of objective physical reality point of view, the same amount of damage has been done. A person has been punched in the face. And so we start to see that the interactions between separate bodies has a higher moral significance than the interaction between a body and itself. And when you have groups of people, which includes families and organizations and countries and whatever else, the same could be said. It's probably worse for a country to execute a different country's person than it is for them to execute one of their own. It doesn't mean that executing one of your own is a good thing. It's not a good thing. But it's probably less of an ethical problem than executing somebody from another country. The same goes with war. Like a civil war, it's a lot more ethically ambiguous than going to war with another country. And so it seems to be relatively straightforward to me that everything has an ethical implication, but when you're talking about bodies interacting with other bodies, those tend to have a higher weight to their ethical implications. And so when we zoom out a little bit and we actually start to think about today and nations and geopolitics and what this all really means, right here someone in the comments has just said, because you have more rights to how to deal with your own body, not others. And the thing about rights is, first of all, that's not a thing that exists, right? Rights don't naturally exist. We've created them. And I think that those rights are reflections of our views of morality and ethics, which is exactly mirroring what I've said. The interaction between bodies is more of an issue than the interaction of one's own body. And so I think that when we talk about geopolitics today and we examine what's happening, when we see that a nation like China, for example, isn't out in the world airstriking other countries and starting wars with other countries, doesn't mean it's a perfect place. But I think that that's a really good starting place to start evaluating what are countries doing to each other and what's a relatively good example of how to behave. This is not a isn't China so wonderful thing, it's just a truth. It just happens to be that today China's not in any wars with other countries bombing them, right? That's pretty good. There's a lot of disputes that happen with China. There's a lot of, suboptimal relations that happen, but it isn't the case that China is engaged in wars. That means I don't really have a lot to talk about when it comes to China's position in the world. What am I supposed to talk about? Hey, China, stop bombing Libya. They're not bombing Libya, right? So this already sort of silences the conversation on that end, because if you look at the grand scheme of what's happening in the world, you have to be very nitpicky and ignore a lot of major things that are happening in the world to target China for its international policies. Specifically, you have to essentially stand on piles of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of corpses created by many other countries to use binoculars and aim them down at China and try to figure out something wrong that it's doing. And this is one of the reasons that you'll find a lot of these far-right commentators, they try very hard to make everything about China seem horrible, but especially they focus on the international politics. And that's because they really, really want China's international politics and China's international positions to seem warlike and aggressive. And the reason for that is that justifies further aggression from other countries towards China, and that's ultimately what they want. So let's go back to the body thing. We've got a bunch of countries, we've got a bunch of people, and if we zoom out further, we have Earth, which for all intents and purposes today is all of life and all of existence that we know about. Every thought, every human, everything. And so if we view Earth as a body, then the nations could be viewed as its organs, and we can really strive for the health of the Earth in all ways possible. It doesn't mean we all each individually can focus on everything at the same time. Okay, there's a lot of problems that I don't talk about because, I'm focused on other things. But what I'm focused on is trying to preserve the stability of the Earth by examining the way that its organs interact with each other. And those organs are countries. I personally would prefer that we don't go to war, that we don't have a World War III, that we don't have to enter the horrible existence that is a global war. Because as you really examine history, we all think to ourselves like, oh, World War II, that was horrible, but it's so far behind us. And World War I, I guess that was bad and stuff. They had mustard gas, and it just seems so distant. But when you actually zoom back to those times and read all the articles and read the books and really look at the international politics back then, there were warning signs before these events happened. I will probably do a video talking about this soon, but people think that Japan, for example, just randomly invaded China in 1931 with no warning, but that's actually not what happened at all. I have uncovered many direct and specific warnings of them talking about invading Manchuria 20 years before they did it. Okay, like literally, this was not an unknown thing. Even just a few minutes ago, I was adding to the timeline Japan declaring that they were the only country which could save East Asia in 1914. Okay, that's not 1931, not 1930, way before that. So the point is, when I look out and I see what's happening in the world, I look for these warning signs. And currently, my own country is one of those countries that's producing these warning signs. They're producing this mindset of, if China, just as an example, sends warships to South China, then that may end up in World War III, as if that somehow has something to do with China doing something wrong. We don't even have to like China to understand this concept that a country going to the other side of the world to declare that if a different country does something within its own borders that may lead to World War III is potentially a big warning sign, and we need to talk about how to mitigate that risk. Because I assure you that America is not completely full of shit. It will actually act. It has before, and it could again. And that's the thing that I don't want to happen. I don't want to see a war. Now, when would I ever turn against China? dear viewers, when would I ever betray my alleged overlords that secretly fund this one-man shop of rigorous editing all day long to talk to you guys? When would I betray this country? When would I really speak out against China and what it's doing internationally? Well, that's very simple. It's very easy to answer that question. When China starts going to America with warships and telling America that if they move their submarine from the coast of California to Catalina Island, that may cause World War III because China doesn't recognize Catalina Island as part of America, I'm going to be the first person to be calling out China directly and specifically. And that's because no matter what happens in China or in the United States, to me, that is much more dangerous and much more urgent and important than anything else that we're talking about. I often get accused of overlooking things or not talking about certain things, even though I'm aware of them. But the real truth is I'm talking about what I want to talk about, which is what I think is the most important, which today and in 2021 in August happens to be, in my opinion, the relations surrounding the interactions between China and the United States. And in that set of interactions, there's one clear aggressor, and that aggressor is the United States. And the reason that I want to fight interventionism and the concept of going to another part of the world and telling them how they should act at threat of war is that all the history that I'm seeing tells me that that's what leads to actual war. And actual war, even back 70 years ago, meant millions and millions of dead people. Like tens, even 100 million dead people. So to me, that absolutely dwarfs almost any other subject. If you want to talk to me about, you know, the rights of Mexicans to enter America, oh, okay, you know, I might have some loose comments about that, but I really don't see how that has anything to do with what the world should be focused on if what we care about is the amount of cells that live, the amount of organs that survive, the body itself being able to survive. I just don't, you know, it just seems like a very minor issue to me compared to the threat of tens or dozens or hundreds of millions of people being wiped out over something so stupid as war. So that's really how I see things. That's why I focus on the things that I do. And that's why, you know, I don't do a lot of videos talking about Black Lives Matter or, you know, animals or other things that I do have opinions about and I do care about. Because I just have limited time to do things. And what I'm focused on is what is potentially going to lead to the end of this body that I think is actually pretty cool, called Earth.